My name is Corporal Reyes Okonkwo Lindquist, and I was there on the day everything changed. I want to tell this story the way it really happened, not the way people now tell it around fires and in bars across 100 worlds. The truth is stranger and simpler than the legend. 3 months before that day, humanity was still new to the galaxy. We had only just learned that we were not alone. A group of alien nations called the Coalition had found us, studied us, and decided we were useful enough to bring into their long war against an empire called the Vithari Ascendancy. The Vithari had been pushing into Coalition space for 200 years. Whole worlds had fallen to them. Whole species had been pushed to the edge of extinction. The Coalition needed more soldiers, and humans, it seemed, were very good at fighting. I did not choose to be a soldier because I loved war. I chose it because when the offer came, our world was frightened. We had just learned that the universe was full of empires older and stronger than us, and some of them wanted what little we had. Joining the Coalition felt like the only way to protect our home, so I signed up, along with millions of others. We trained for 6 weeks under alien instructors who did not understand us, and then we were given translator implants, basic gear, and a place on the front lines. The aliens called us auxiliary support. That is a polite way of saying we were not expected to matter much. We were the newest species anyone in that war had ever seen, and the older empires, the ones who had been fighting for centuries, looked at us the way a grown man might look at a child holding a stick and pretending it is a sword. They did not think we would change anything. They thought we would die quietly on some forgotten battlefield, and the war would go on exactly as it always had. I remember the day we were told about Thenvashi. It was a small moon, gray and rocky, orbiting a gas giant far from any world I had ever heard of. It had no real value on its own, but it sat next to a supply route the Coalition needed to protect. The Vithari had landed a large armored force there, and 2 attempts by Coalition soldiers to push them back had already failed. Our company, the 3rd Human Expeditionary Company, was given the job of taking the eastern ridge while larger Coalition forces attacked from the west. Fleet Marshal Osai Ren gave us our orders personally, which surprised everyone. He was a tall being with 4 eyes, and a voice that never seemed to rise or fall, no matter what he was saying. He told us, quite plainly, that we were not expected to defeat the main Vithari force. Our job was to hold the ridge, wait for reinforcements, and stay out of real trouble. He said humans were too new to this kind of war to be trusted with anything more important. I did not feel insulted by that at the time. I understood it. We were new. We did not have shield generators like the Coalition's older members. We did not have the long-range scanners or the smart weapons that could track a target through solid rock. What we had was basic gear, strong legs, and 300 years of human military history that none of the aliens around us had ever bothered to study. We landed on Thenvashi in the dark hours before the moon's short dawn. The drop was smooth, and for a while it seemed like the whole operation would go exactly as planned. Sergeant Okafor, our commanding officer, walked among us as we set up on the ridge, checking gear, checking morale, making small jokes to keep everyone calm. He was not a large man, but he had a way of making you feel like nothing could go wrong as long as he was nearby. Then, almost too fast to notice, everything did go wrong. The Vithari struck first, and they struck smart. They did not attack our soldiers directly. Instead, they hit our communication relay and destroyed most of our air support before we even knew they had moved. It was the same tactic they had used against many new Coalition members before us: cut the head off the operation and watch the body panic. It had worked against species far older and better equipped than us. There was no reason to think it would not work against humans too. For a moment, there was real fear on that ridge. I remember looking around and seeing confused faces, soldiers checking dead comm units, glancing toward the sky where our support ships had been only minutes before. It would have been easy, in that moment, for the whole company to fall apart. That is exactly what the Vithari were counting on. Sergeant Okafor did not let that happen. He looked at the broken comm relay, looked at the ridge, looked at the distant shapes of Vithari armored vehicles moving toward us in perfect formation, and he said 4 words that I will remember until the day I die. Guess we're improvising. It sounds like such a small thing now, but at that moment, it changed everything. It reminded us that we did not need a perfect plan handed down from orbit. We had trained for this. We had studied maps of that ridge the night before, walking every inch of it ourselves because our scanners were not as good as the ones the Coalition trusted. We knew the ground better than any alien pilot circling far above us ever could. The Vithari came forward in the same formation they always used, tight and disciplined, a wall of armored vehicles rolling toward our position with a kind of calm confidence that only comes from centuries of victory. They expected us to hold position and wait to be crushed, the way so many other new coalition members had done before us. We did something else instead. The night before, while the rest of the operation focused on bigger targets, our engineers had quietly placed explosive charges through a narrow canyon that led directly into our position. It was not a clever secret weapon. It was simple, old-fashioned battlefield preparation, the kind humans have used for thousands of years. Nobody had told us not to do it, mostly because nobody in Coalition Command had thought to ask what we were doing with our free time the night before battle. When the Vithari column entered that canyon, following the path that looked the safest and most direct, Sergeant Okafor gave the signal. I still remember the sound. It was not loud in the way you might imagine from stories. It was more like the ground itself took a breath and let it out all at once. The lead Vithari transport, a vehicle the size of a large building, was lifted and turned aside as if it weighed nothing at all. Smoke and dust rose into the pale sky of that little moon, and for the first time since the war with the Vithari had begun, their disciplined formation broke apart. I learned later, from coalition observers watching from orbit, that this had never happened before. Not once in 200 years of war had a Vithari column broken formation under fire. Their entire military doctrine was built on the idea that discipline always wins, that no enemy could shake their resolve. We had just done exactly that, using nothing more advanced than good planning and the freedom to make our own decisions. But breaking their formation was not the end of the fight. It was only the beginning of the part that truly surprised everyone watching. Vithari soldiers, trained for 2 centuries of steady, careful warfare, began to pull back to regroup. That was the correct move, according to every rule of tactics the coalition had ever taught. When a formation breaks, you retreat, reorganize, and come back with a stronger plan. It is what every species in that war had always done, including us in our earlier training exercises. Instead, humans went forward. I was near the front of that advance, and I remember the strange mix of fear and clarity that filled me as I moved down from the ridge toward the broken Vithari lines. I was frightened, of course. Anyone who tells you they were not frightened in that moment is not telling the truth. But somewhere underneath that fear was something older, something that did not belong only to me but to every human who has ever had to fight for something they loved. It was the simple, stubborn refusal to stop just because the moment was dangerous. Private Daesung Park, barely 20 years old, was one of the first over the ridge. I remember him shouting as he ran, not in fear but in something closer to determination, calling out words in Korean that I did not fully understand until later, when he explained they were something his grandfather used to say before difficult work. He was not the only one shouting. All along that line, humans were moving forward with a kind of noise and energy that must have seemed completely alien to the soldiers we were facing. The Vithari commander, whose reactions were later studied by coalition strategists for months afterward, froze for 2 full seconds when he saw us advancing instead of retreating. 2 seconds does not sound like much, but in that kind of fight, 2 seconds can decide everything. His soldiers, trained to expect retreat and regrouping from a broken enemy, did not know how to respond to an enemy that ran directly toward danger instead of away from it. I think about that moment often. Why did we do it? I have read many explanations since then, written by scientists and historians trying to understand what makes humans fight the way we do. Some say it comes from our long history of hunting animals across open land, chasing prey for hours instead of giving up at the first sign of difficulty. Others say it comes from thousands of years of wars fought over small pieces of land, where retreating often meant losing everything that mattered. I am not a scientist, and I cannot say for certain which explanation is right. All I know is that in that moment, going forward felt more natural than pulling back, even though every part of my training in the coalition had taught me to expect the opposite instinct from myself. The fight that followed was intense, but it did not last as long as I expected. Once the Vithari line broke and their soldiers realized we were not going to stop, their confidence collapsed along with their formation. Many of them retreated entirely, leaving behind vehicles and equipment that our engineers would later study for months. Others surrendered, something the Vithari almost never did, because their culture placed enormous value on completing a mission no matter the cost. I remember one of their officers, through a translator device, asking our medics a simple question after he was taken from the field. He wanted to know why we had not stopped when the smart choice was clearly to hold our position and wait for support. Nobody had a perfect answer for him. I am not sure a perfect answer exists. We held that ridge for 6 more hours before coalition reinforcements finally arrived. We lost 14 soldiers that day, each one a friend, each one someone I still think about. War is never something to celebrate, and I want to be honest about that even while telling this story. But because of what we did on that ridge, the Vithari lost their entire armored column, and more importantly, They lost something that could not be replaced as easily as vehicles or weapons. They lost the certainty that their old methods would always work against anyone who stood in their way. When Fleet Marshal Osai Ren arrived with the relief force, he walked through the wreckage of the Vithari column with all four eyes wide, looking at the scene as if he could not quite believe what he was seeing. I remember him standing near Sergeant Okafor, watching the smoke rise from destroyed vehicles that should have crushed our position without much trouble. He asked one simple question: how did you win? Sergeant Okafor, calm as ever, lit a small cigarette that I am fairly certain was against several coalition safety regulations, and answered in a way that has since been repeated across countless worlds. We didn't know we weren't supposed to. I did not understand at the time how important that battle would become. To us, it was simply a hard day, a day where we lost people we cared about, and barely held our ground against a stronger enemy. It was only later, as reports of the battle spread through Coalition Command, that we began to understand what had actually happened. Word of the fight at Thenvashi spread quickly among the Coalition's many member species. At first, some of the older empires dismissed it as luck, a single unusual event that meant nothing about humans as a whole. They pointed out that the Vithari had underestimated us, and that any advantage gained from surprise would not last once the enemy adjusted their tactics. I understood their doubt. We were new, after all, and it seemed reasonable to think that one battle proved very little. But then came the second battle, a few weeks later, on a world called Halvorn Reach. This time, the Vithari were prepared. They had studied reports of what happened at Thenvashi and adjusted their approach specifically to counter human tactics. They expected us to be aggressive, so they set traps designed to punish soldiers who advanced too quickly. It should have worked. Their planning was careful, and their new tactics were built directly around what they believed they had learned about us. What they did not understand was that human strength was never only about being aggressive. It was about adapting quickly to whatever situation we found ourselves in. When our forward scouts noticed the traps the Vithari had prepared, our officers did not simply repeat the same tactic that had worked before. They changed the plan entirely, splitting our forces and drawing the Vithari defenses out of position, before striking from an unexpected direction. It was a different kind of fight than the one at Thenvashi, but it carried the same spirit. We refused to be predictable, and we refused to give up simply because the enemy had prepared for our previous methods. After Halvorn Reach, the doubts among coalition leadership began to fade. Human units started receiving better equipment, though we always seemed to use it in ways the engineers who built it did not fully expect. We were given more independence in planning our own operations, something that would have been unthinkable during those first difficult months after joining the coalition. Alien officers who had once treated human soldiers with polite dismissal began asking to observe our training exercises, trying to understand what made us fight the way we did. I want to be clear about something, because I think it is important. The legend that grew around humanity after those battles was not about humans being naturally better fighters than every other species in the galaxy. Many of the species we fought alongside were incredibly skilled, disciplined, and brave. The Vithari themselves, despite being our enemy, showed enormous courage and dedication throughout that war. What made humans different was not raw ability. It was something harder to explain, something that had to do with how we thought about difficult situations. Most species in the coalition had long, stable histories. Their military traditions had developed slowly over centuries, or even thousands of years, built on lessons learned through careful, methodical warfare. Humans, by comparison, had a shorter but far more varied history. Our planet's story was filled with sudden, chaotic conflicts, unexpected alliances, and constant adaptation to new challenges. We were used to situations changing quickly, used to plans falling apart and needing to be rebuilt in the middle of a crisis. That kind of flexibility, it turned out, was exactly what was needed against an enemy like the Vithari, who relied heavily on discipline and predictability. As the months passed, more human companies joined the coalition forces, and more stories began to spread. There was the defense of Korin Station, where a small group of human engineers used captured Vithari equipment in ways the Vithari themselves had never intended, turning defensive systems into offensive weapons within hours of capturing them. There was the long standoff at the Ashvale Corridor, where human soldiers held a critical supply route for nearly 2 weeks against overwhelming numbers, using nothing more than clever positioning and a stubborn refusal to give ground. Each story added to the growing reputation that humanity was earning across coalition space, not as the strongest species in the war, but as one of the most unpredictable. I remember, about a year after Thenvashi, sitting in a coalition mess hall with soldiers from several different species. A young coalition officer, still fairly new to combat herself, asked me directly what it felt like to be part of what she called the human legend. I did not have a good answer for her at first. To me, and to everyone I served with, we were not living inside a legend. We were simply doing our jobs, trying to protect our friends, trying to survive difficult situations one day at a time. The idea that our actions were becoming stories told across the galaxy felt strange and a little uncomfortable. But I understood, even then, why the stories mattered to others. For centuries, many of the smaller and newer species in the Coalition had lived in fear of the Vithari ascendancy. They had watched world after world fall to an enemy that seemed unstoppable, an empire whose discipline and technology made resistance feel pointless. When humans arrived and began winning battles that should have been impossible, it gave hope to species who had almost given up hope entirely. Our victories were not just military successes, they were proof that the Vithari could be challenged, that their long streak of dominance was not guaranteed to continue forever. I think that is the real reason the story of Thenvashi became so important. More than the details of the battle itself, it was the first moment, the first crack in what had seemed like an unbreakable wall. Every legend needs a beginning. A single moment, where everything changes, and for humanity's place in that galactic war, our beginning was a small, gray moon that nobody outside the Coalition had ever heard of before that day. Sergeant Okafor never seemed entirely comfortable with how famous that battle became. Years later, after the worst of the war had ended, and a fragile peace had been established between the Coalition and the Vithari ascendancy, I asked him what he thought about being remembered as the officer who started humanity's legend. He laughed, in that quiet way he always did, and told me that he had never been trying to start anything. He had simply been trying to keep his soldiers alive, using whatever tools and knowledge he had available in that moment. He said the real legend was not built by any single officer or any single battle, but by every soldier who chose, again and again, to keep fighting, even when the situation looked impossible. I have thought about his words many times since then. It is easy, when looking back at history, to focus on one dramatic moment, and forget about everything that came before and after it. The truth is that Thenvashi mattered because of what happened afterward, because thousands of human soldiers, on hundreds of different battlefields, continued to bring that same spirit of adaptability and determination to every fight they faced. No single battle creates a legend on its own. It takes a pattern, repeated over and over, until other species begin to notice and remember. Eventually, the Vithari ascendancy's push into coalition space slowed, then stopped entirely, and negotiations for peace began. I will not pretend that humans alone were responsible for that outcome. The war involved dozens of species, countless battles and sacrifices from soldiers across the entire coalition, but there is no question that humanity's arrival changed the shape of that war, in ways nobody could have predicted when we were first given translator implants and told to stay out of serious trouble. Looking back now, from a much safer distance in time, I understand why people tell this story the way they do. They tell it as a moment of triumph, a single day when a new and unproven species proved themselves against overwhelming odds. That version of the story is not wrong, but it leaves out the fear, the confusion, and the loss that were just as real as the victory. I lost friends on that ridge, 14 people who will never see how the story ended, who will never know that their sacrifice became the beginning of something the whole galaxy would remember. I think that is important to remember whenever this story is told. The legend was never really about being unstoppable or invincible. It was about ordinary people, frightened and unprepared for the true scale of galactic war, choosing to stand together and adapt when everything around them seemed to be falling apart. That is not a uniquely human quality, not really. I have seen soldiers from a dozen different species show the same kind of courage in different ways, in different battles, across many different worlds. But on that particular day, on that particular moon, it was humans who stepped onto the battlefield and showed the galaxy something it had never quite seen before. Not a stronger weapon, not a smarter strategy planned months in advance, but a willingness to keep moving forward when the situation demanded something new, something the old rules of that long war had never accounted for. That, I think, is why people still tell this story, even now, many years later. Not because it was the biggest battle of the war, or the most important one in terms of strategy, but because it was the first time the galaxy learned who we really were. And once that lesson was learned, it could never quite be forgotten again. I do not know if future generations will remember my name, or Sergeant Okafor's name, or the names of the 14 soldiers we lost on that ridge. Legends have a way of simplifying things over time, keeping the broad shape of a story while losing many of the smaller, more personal details. But I hope, whenever this story is told, that people remember it was never really about becoming legendary. It was about ordinary soldiers doing their best in an impossible situation, and in doing so, quietly changing the course of galactic history without ever intending to. That is the true story of the day our legend began. Not a perfect story, not a simple one, but an honest one. And I think that is exactly how it should be remembered.